Hello, my name is Ethan Strauch, and for my midterm presentation, I will be going over Chapter 14, which focuses on the money supply process. This chapter provides an overview of how commercial banks create deposits and describes the basic principles of the money supply creation process. These are the learning goals that I'm going to cover during this presentation. The chapter covers a few more, but they primarily deal with the accounting and calculations, whereas I will hone in on the concepts and applications more so. So these learning objectives consist of listing and describing the three players that influence the money supply, classifying the factors affecting the Federal Reserve's assets and liabilities, identifying the factors that affect the monetary base and discussing their effects on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, and identifying how the Fed controls the money supply in the real world. So there are three main players in the money supply process. There's the central bank, which we commonly refer to as the Fed, banks in general, which are just all depository institutions and financial intermediaries, and then depositors, which are individuals or a company, basically anybody that has money in a bank account. Next, we're going to go over the Fed's balance sheet. The Fed's balance sheet is fairly unconventional, so it's somewhat difficult to understand initially. The Fed does not share the same assets and liabilities that companies or individuals do, so we're going to look over the simplified balance sheet provided here. For the Fed, currency that is in circulation is considered a liability, along with reserves held by banks, whereas securities and loans to banks are classified as assets because the Fed gains interest on them or discounts on these financial tools. Controlling the monetary base may be a very easily calculated formula, but it represents a very important number. This measure of money supply typically only includes the most liquid currencies. It is calculated simply by adding the currency in circulation to the total reserves held by a financial institution. Now, although there's only two variables in this equation, those variables are affected by a number of other variables, which we'll cover shortly. The first scenario that we're going to cover is an open market purchase from a bank. So as you can see in this example, making an open market purchase increases the assets of the banking system because that security is sold for cash. The proceeds held by the banking system are considered reserves, which increase the monetary base. So the net result is that the reserves have increased by $100, there's no change in the currency, and the monetary base has risen by $100 as well due to the increase in reserves. Here is another example of an open market purchase, but this is from the public. So here, the person selling the bond cashes the Fed's check. Reserves are unchanged. Currency in circulation increases by the amount of the open market purchase. The monetary base increases by the amount of the open market purchase. So in summary, the effect of an open market purchase on reserves depends on whether the seller of the bonds keeps the proceeds from the sale in currency or in deposits. The effect of an open market purchase on the monetary base always increases the monetary base by the amount of the purchase. Here are the last set of tables that we're going to go over, and these are the shifts from deposits into currency. These set of tables are used to demonstrate the stability of the monetary base. Most of the movement of money in our financial system works harmoniously to maintain a stable monetary base. To the public, it doesn't matter whether or not the money is held in cash or a checking account, especially with interest rates these days at basically zero. The banking system fluctuates often because of deposits and withdrawals of money in checking accounts, but that's cyclical and common, so it's not of concern. And for the Fed, it causes reserves to decrease, but increases currency in circulation, so there's no net change because the two variables that affect it are moving in opposite directions. Now, there are a few other factors that affect the monetary base, but they're not covered much in depth in this chapter, so we're just going to glance over them. These three factors are float, treasury deposits at the Federal Reserve, and interventions in the foreign exchange market. Float is predominantly the one that I wanted to address because it's something that you and I as consumers can affect a little bit. Float is money in the banking system that is briefly counted twice due to delays in processing checks. Float is created when a bank credits a customer's account as soon as a check is deposited. However, it takes some time for the check to be received from the payer's bank. Until the check clears from the payer's bank, the amount of the check appears in the accounts of both the recipient's and payer's bank. Although this doesn't quite happen as much as it used to, since checks these days are nearly obsolete, still with just the sheer volume of or population of the United States, it still is enough to make a little bit of a dent in it. So here's a great slide that shows the overview of the money supply process. It explains what players can manipulate which variables for what reasons to cause a change in the money supply. So one of the most common ways in which the Federal Reserve can affect the money supply is by changing how much non-borrowed monetary base is available. So by increasing the non-borrowed monetary base, money supply increases because that allows to have more of money supply for deposit creation. The Federal Reserve can also require a higher reserve ratio for banks, which means they have to keep more money as reserve, which decreases the money supply because there's less money available for deposits. Banks, they can also manipulate the money supply by increasing borrowed reserves. By increasing borrowed reserves, it increases the monetary base for deposit creation. They can also increase their excess reserves, which is very similar to the Federal Reserve requiring higher reserve ratios. This decreases the money supply because it allows for less loans and deposit creation because less money is available. And finally, depositors, which would be you and I, can decrease the money supply by holding more money in the form of currency. This allows for less deposits because we're not interacting with the bank systems. We're just holding the money in cash. So learning about the monetary base and money supply is all well and good, but what about its actual application? This graph here helps show what the Fed does and why the money supply is an important concept to study. When the global financial crisis began in the fall of 2007, the Fed initiated lending programs and large-scale asset purchase programs in an attempt to bolster the economy. By June 2014, these purchases of securities had led to a quintupling of the Fed's balance sheet and a 377% increase in the monetary base. These lending and asset purchase programs resulted in a huge expansion of the monetary base and have been given the name quantitative easing, which I'm sure you have heard in the media over the last several years. This increase in monetary base did not lead to an equivalent change in the money supply, though, because of excess reserves rose dramatically. Reserves rose so dramatically because people lost confidence in the economy and the market. Although, as the graph shows, people began to gain more and more confidence as quantitative easing proved effective and the market then followed suit. Overall, I agree with the Fed's decision to implement quantitative easing by controlling the money supply. Though I don't necessarily find the money supply process to be particularly exciting, it is evident that it's valuable to understand its purpose in our economy.